Hi everyone. In this video, I want to talk about monetary policy, and I encourage all of you to review chapter 14, where we discussed money market before you start reading this chapter. If you don't remember money market, money demand, money supply, and also review chapter 12, which was about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. If you remember in chapter 13, where we discussed fiscal policy, we were trying actually to see how the government is able to fix the problems we have in the economy, like recession, inflation, by using by changing government expenses or taxes, basically by implementing a specific fiscal policy. In this chapter, we're going to talk about Federal Reserve as a central bank in United States and see how the Federal Reserve actually can help us out when we are dealing with recession or inflation. So, if you remember, we talked about in chapter 14 about the Federal Reserve, structure of the Federal Reserve. We talked about FOMC, we talked about Federal Reserve policy tools, and we also saw basically how the Federal Reserve can change, let's say, the interest rate in the market by changing the supply of money using all those policy tools like required reserve ratio, like discount rate, like open market operation. We have more than actually three policy tools for the Federal Reserve, but we're just focusing on these three for at least for our class. If you are an econ major, you will learn more in more kind of advanced macroeconomic courses that you will take. Basically, the Federal Reserve is in charge of any changes in the money market, and the monetary policy that we're going to discuss in this chapter is also initiated by it can be initiated by the Federal Reserve. Okay, so since the Federal Reserve controls the money market, the Federal Reserve can basically implement different types of monetary policy when we are dealing with changes in the business cycle, when we have, let's say, recession, or when we have when we have inflation. Okay, so now let's talk about different types of monetary policy. And just like chapter 13, where we discuss fiscal policy, we'll see when the Federal Reserve basically implements different type of monetary policy. The first one is called expansionary, which is very similar to what we had in chapter 13. Another name for it is easy monetary policy or expansionary monetary policy. And then we have restrictive or tight monetary policy. Let's talk a little bit about the first one, expansionary one, okay, or easy monetary policy. The concept is very similar to expansionary fiscal policy that we had in chapter 13. The goal for the Federal Reserve here is to boost the economy by increasing the aggregate demand, because we want to fight recession here. So the economy is slow, the level of output is low, unemployment rate is high. So in chapter 13, we'll learn that the government can start spending more money in the economy to increase the aggregate demand, or the government can offer tax cut. Both tax cut and increasing government spending could actually increase the aggregate demand. But remember the multiplier effect that we talked about in chapter 13. So definitely review that for this part if you do not remember, because the concept again is very kind of similar. Here, the Federal Reserve now is in charge of basically handling, let's say, recession. Okay, and the Federal Reserve this time wants to basically boost the economy by implementing expansionary monetary policy. Let's see how the expansionary monetary policy is going to work out. And by the way, check out the other videos that I posted on D12 for this part, okay? I tried actually to break the monetary policy down step by step. I'm just going to go over the slides quickly, but definitely watch those videos. So the goal here is for the Federal Reserve to increase the aggregate demand. Remember, one of the components of aggregate demand is investment. Again, from chapter 12. If you do not recall, definitely review chapter 12. So the Federal Reserve basically is going to target this investment, okay? Also, the Federal Reserve can, just as a side note, remember that the Federal Reserve can also indirectly um, um, changes the C component, consumption expenditures in aggregate demand, okay? So in order for the Federal Reserve to change the aggregate demand, the Federal Reserve is going to target investment directly. The goal here is to increase the aggregate demand, so the Federal Reserve can do that by increasing investment. How? There is a relationship between investment and interest rate, right? Interest rate we learned in chapter 14, that is the opportunity cost of holding money, right? So if the Federal Reserve basically decreases the interest rate, then the investment automatically will go up. If interest rate decreases, it means that the opportunity cost of borrowing money is also low. So people are going actually to borrow more money. The investors are going to get more loans. They're going to spend more money in the economy. Same thing goes to households. If the interest rate is low, you're going to buy a new house. You're going to get a new loan to get a car. So people back actually start spending more and more money because of low interest rate. So we learned also in chapter 14 that there was an inverse relationship between the interest rate and the supply of money. Remember that the Federal Reserve controls the money market, so the Federal Reserve can change the interest rate by changing the supply of money. The goal here for the Fed is to reduce the interest rate. So to do that, the Federal Reserve should increase the supply of money that we learned about it actually in chapter 14. So Federal Reserve is going to change few things in the money market, and then you will see the impact right away on the aggregate demand, okay, at the macroeconomic equilibrium. So this is the money market graph that we also had in chapter 14. If you remember, we had a downward slope money demand, typical shape for a demand. There was an inverse relationship between the interest rate, which is the price in this market, and the quantity of money demanded. That was the amount of money that households and individuals and businesses actually want to hold. And then we had a vertical margin, not marginal, sorry. And then we had a vertical supply of money. And we had this shape for the supply because the only authority that can change the supply of money in the money market is Federal Reserve. So no matter what the interest rate is in the market, the quantity supplied of money is given and fixed at a given time. Okay, so that's why we had this vertical shape. So remember that the goal here for the Federal Reserve is to increase the aggregate demand by reducing the interest rate. And we know that there is an inverse relationship between interest rate and the supply of money. So the Federal Reserve basically should increase the supply of money. And the Federal Reserve can do that by increasing the discount rate, by increasing the required reserve ratio, and so forth that we discussed in chapter 14. As a result of this increase in supply of money, the supply of money, or MS, will shift to the right. We have a rightward shift here. The demand is not going to change in the money market. The demand is fixed, but we will have a new equilibrium, which is the intersection of our current MD and our new MS, which is MS1. And as you can see on the graph, the interest rate is going to drop from 5% to 4% at the new equilibrium. And that was the goal of the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve is trying to reduce the interest rate so people actually going to borrow more money and start spending more money in the economy. That's how the Federal Reserve can kind of deal with recession and boost the economy, increase the GDP. Okay, so The goal is achieved by the Federal Reserve in the money market. The Federal Reserve increased the supply of money. As a result, the interest rate went down. Now let's see what's happening at the macroeconomic level. So we have recession, right? It means that the level of output is low. In the other word, the actual GDP we have, or the actual real GDP we have, is less than potential GDP, right? So we have the recessionary gap. There is a gap between potential GDP and real GDP. And since we have recession, in fact, the level of output in the economy is pretty low. The production actually went down because of recession, right? So the Federal Reserve already changed something in the money market. Now we like to see what's going to happen at the macroeconomic level. Again, don't forget that the initial goal for the Fed was to increase the aggregate demand, right? Because if we can fix the aggregate demand, increase the aggregate demand, basically, we can deal with recession. We can eliminate the recessionary gap. The interest rate went down. As a result, the investment component in aggregate demand will increase. So aggregate demand will go up, and we have a rightward shift in aggregate demand because of the increase in investment and somehow because of the increase in consumption expenditures, because we can also see the individuals going to the bank, and they borrow money, they change their houses, they buy new cars, and so forth. They take personal loans because the interest rate is just low. And remember the multiplier effect we talked about. The aggregate demand is not going to jump right away. It will take time for the market to adjust itself. So first the aggregate demand will go up, let's say by delta E, and then because of the multiplier effect, we have this gradual change in aggregate demand. But aggregate demand can go up again because the real GDP is going to go up. If the real GDP increases, it means that people's income is going up. So they're going actually to spend more money. So the consumption expenditure actually is going to increase. As a result, the aggregate demand one more time will increase. Till the aggregate, so we have this constant change in aggregate demand till we are back to full employment, till there is no recessionary gap. And we're going to see this rightward shift in aggregate demand till potential GDP equals real GDP. Then the problem will be solved. No more recession. And that was the goal of the Federal Reserve. For inflation, or dealing with inflation or inflationary gap, the Federal Reserve actually is going to do something else. Really do not need to know all these slides that I put here. It's just for your information. I'm not going to ask anything else. The only thing you need to know is basically how the Federal Reserve is dealing with recession and inflation. For inflation is exactly the opposite. The goal of the Federal Reserve is to reduce the aggregate demand here. And again, the Federal Reserve is going to target the interest rate. This time, however, the Federal Reserve doesn't want people to borrow money. The Federal Reserve doesn't want us to spend money. The Fed wants to reduce the consumption expenditures and investment. As a result, the goal of the Federal Reserve here is to increase the interest rate. And the Fed can easily do that in the money market by reducing the supply of money, by reducing, let's say, discount rate, by reducing the required reserve ratio, or by open market operation, by selling government securities to the public. So all these actions can reduce the supply of money. So we have a leftward shift this time in money supply. So the supply of money will shift to the left. And you can see that at the new equilibrium, the interest rate went up from 5% to 6%. So Federal Reserve achieved its goal, which was increasing the interest rate, increasing the opportunity cost of borrowing money. So the Federal Reserve is going basically to discourage everyone from borrowing money, from investing, from taking personal loans, changing their houses or whatnot. So the interest rate is high. Let's see what's going to happen in the macroeconomic equilibrium. So we have inflation. the Federal Reserve is trying to deal with inflation, right? So the goal, remember, was to reduce the aggregate supply, to bring this AD0 to the left, because we have a gap between real GDP, which in this example is 13.2, and potential GDP, which is 13 trillions of dollars. The Federal Reserve is trying to eliminate this inflationary gap. So the Fed increased the interest rate. As a result, investment and consumption expenditures are both going to go down. So the aggregate demand will decrease. Again, because of the multiplier effect, this reduction in aggregate demand is going to happen in couple of steps over time or gradually. So the aggregate demand is going down and is shifting to the left. Let's say the amount of change in aggregate demand is delta E. And then when the real GDP decreases for everybody in the economy, then you can expect actually people to spend less money, because the less real GDP means less amount of income for everybody, right, in the country. So one more time, consumption expenditures and investments are going to drop, and aggregate demand will shift leftwards again till we are back to full employment, where potential GDP is equal to real GDP, which in this example is $13. And remember, we were trying to eliminate the inflationary gap. We are fighting with inflation. So so if you look at the price level went down from 125 to 120. That was the goal for the Federal Reserve, to reduce the inflation rate, right? And the Federal Reserve was able to do that. So you can compare this chapter with chapter 13 and see basically how government and the Federal Reserve are both reacting to recession and inflation, and how both government and the Fed are going to fight with recession and inflation. It's good actually to compare them, put them together. And remember that in real example or in real life, most of the time the government and the Federal Reserve, they take actually actions together, because it is going to be more effective, especially if you're dealing with recession. So the Federal Reserve and government are both going to be involved in the economy, because at the same time, the government can change things with, let's say, its own spending. At the same time, the Federal Reserve can reduce the interest rate. So during the recession we had in 2007, 2006, and also the recession because of the COVID, the pandemic, in both cases, you can see that the government and the Federal Reserves are working together. The Federal Reserve in both cases, in the recession in 2006, 2007, and even during pandemic, the Federal Reserve reduced the interest rate and kept the interest rate low, to basically encourage people to trust the future and start spending money, start borrowing money. And at the same time, the government has started with initiating stimulus checks, stimulus packages, right? So government is spending and low interest rate by the Federal Reserve, they both could kind of help the economy, can basically let the economy back on track. In 2007, 2008, that it started actually from 2006, and it went on, it got worse in 2007 and 2008. We actually deal with a really nasty recession that took us almost 10 years to recover. The recession, in my opinion, because of pandemic, will be resolved faster because more people are vaccinated and other factors. Actually, when we were actually in a good shape when the recession happened, except, again, in my opinion, the interest rate. We were ready to see higher interest rate, but unfortunately, the interest rate, again, the Federal Reserve reduced the interest rate, I should say, at the end of President Obama's presidency, when the economy actually was in better shape. The Federal Reserve started actually to increase the interest rate because just for the reasons that we discussed, that make us actually ready if that there is another recession, the Federal Reserve can cut back the interest rate, keep it low for the economy basically to roll and to boom. But during President Trump presidency, the Federal Reserve again started to cut the interest rate and reduce the interest rate, which is, again, in my opinion, as an economist, was absolutely unnecessary and absolutely wrong. That's why the Federal Reserve right now, because of pandemic, doesn't have that much power because the interest rate was already low. And that the only thing that the Federal Reserve is doing right now is to promise us that the interest rate will remain low, which is again a good thing. But if the interest rate was a little bit higher than what it was before pandemic, the Federal Reserve actually could take more actions that were more effective and could actually help us to deal with recession and to kind of recover from the recession. But we didn't have that luxury, okay, which I believe it was a mistake for the Federal Reserve to cut it when we had a healthy and growing economy. All right. Anyhow, I hope that you learned something from this video. Again, watch the other ones that I posted on D2L, and till next time.